Hi, this is Byron Stripling from the Columbus Jazz Orchestra, and this is Offstage Live. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The Columbus Jazz Orchestra is delicious, nutritious, good, and good for you. We continue to work at serving you the greatest jazz on the planet, and we want you to know that as soon as we're able, we're going to be back with the finest hand-clapping, toe-tapping, belly-bumping music on the planet. This week's book selection comes from a book I just finished just a few days ago. I was encouraged to read it by our great Columbus Jazz Orchestra saxophonist Pete Mills, and it is entitled Good Things Happen Slowly. It's a memoir by the amazing jazz piano player Fred Hirsch. Now, I've heard Fred in concert, and his style combines kind of a bebop, like a pop, classical, and folk style to create an amazing, innovative style. It's also inspiring because it gives us an up-close yet inspiring look at his fight against HIV and AIDS. This includes a 2-month-long period when he was in a coma, but it also includes his triumphant physical and mental and emotional and musical, most importantly, his return, which includes Grammy nominations and sold-out concert appearances. Once again, the book is called Good Things Happen Slowly by the great Fred Hirsch. Looks like this one here. We encourage you to pick that one up and have a very inspiring read. Incidentally, if you'd like to help the Columbus Jazz Orchestra and also the Jazz Group, please consider returning the tickets that you may have purchased for our canceled March and April shows. You can return them to Kappa. They turn those tickets into a donation for our organization, and we need your help now more than ever. You can reach Kappa, which is the Columbus Association for Performing Arts, at 614-469-0939. Our quote from the day comes from Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. I recommended his book, Man's Search for Meaning, at our first April show, and he reminds us that I never would have made it if I could not have laughed. It lifted me momentarily out of this horrible situation, just enough to make it livable. Always inspiring words from the great Viktor Frankl. Ladies and gentlemen, this past Thursday, our director of jazz education, Zach Compton, I almost called him Jazz Compton. Zach Compton interviewed our founder, the great Ray Eubanks. And if you didn't see it, you can find it on our YouTube channel as well as right here on Facebook in our archives. Ray Eubanks was truly a visionary, and the Jazz Arts Group and the Columbus Jazz Orchestra exist today because of his tireless efforts. Please consider making a 100% tax-deductible gift to the Jazz Arts Group via our jazzemergencyfund.com website. As you know, the coronavirus situation has really devastated the arts community, but you have been so incredible in helping us. So go to jazzemergencyfund.com. That's the website. There you can make a gift via credit card or get information on where to send a check. The Jazz Arts Group was founded in 1973, so perhaps you could think of giving us a donation of $19.73, or you could even try for $1,973. There you go. But in any case, we appreciate gifts of all sizes because we know that no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. This week, special thank yous go out to our donors, Barbara and Gary Douglas, Stephen and Lisa Lex, Mark and Sue Rio. We're so appreciative of. We had a donation coming from Judy Delick, Frank Brioni, Barbara and Gary Douglas, as well as Stephen and Lisa Lex, Kyle and George, and also Vanessa. We thank you. And Powell, we always thank you, as well as Jerry Jurgensen, Dennis, Ann and Tom, John and Patricia, Tom and Joan, and Sandy Alabrano. Happy birthday to you, and we thank you so much for your love. Not everyone is able to help us financially at this time, and we understand that. But there are other ways you can help us. So share the good news of the Jazz Arts Group the following ways. You can like us on our Facebook page. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Instagram. Choose our organization on Amazon Smile. Those are all the ways. I'm pleased to announce, ladies and gentlemen, next Sunday, we will welcome the amazing jazz singer, Miss Carmen Bradford. She was the last singer that Count Basie hired and has since traveled the world spreading the joy of jazz. You've seen her on The Tonight Show, various TV specials, on almost every major concert stage in the United States and Europe, as well as China, Russia, Singapore, and beyond. a talented storyteller with an ebullient heart, a kind, loving kindness. Her spirit is just so beautiful. We love her so much. You cannot miss our interview with the great Miss Carmen Bradford. And now, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and children of all ages, this week we welcome a world-renowned jazz scholar, band leader, and jazz saxophone player. He's the former executive director and currently senior scholar of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. He's lectured and taught at lectured jazz at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which I think I saw a video of one of those presentations years ago. It was fantastic. He's lectured at the Juilliard School of Music, jazz at Lincoln Center, the Manhattan School of Music, and institutions around the world. His book, The NPR Curious Listener's Guide to Jazz, as well as his Grammy Award-winning liner notes and incredible jazz scholarship, is informed by deep study and deep knowledge. However, his performances as a musician and conductor, in addition to his close personal association with jazz legends like Benny Goodman, like Bobby Short, like Mel Lewis, like Teddy Wilson, like Roy Eldridge, like Panama Francis, like the great Joe Jones, and so many others, gives him credibility to speak as a fellow musician who has also performed live on stage with many of the same musicians he speaks and writes about. But before I introduce him, I want you to listen to him as a member of Benny Goodman's orchestra. Just a few bars of that, if you could, Alexa. What great memories. Incredible. Incredible. Hey, Alexa, is there any way I can see a full screen? Are you doing that or do I do that? You could tell me any way you want to. I should look at my chat. I just see, all I see is, there it is. I see Loren, and you look so pretty, Loren.
Well, I'm doing my best. I mean, look at what I'm up against here. You look wonderful.
Well, thank you, and what a joy.
Marvelous, simply marvelous.
You're just too marvelous. Look here, so thank you again for joining us. We just saw an amazing clip, and in that band, you were sitting down there playing, I think, was it second tenor chair?
Well, yeah. That was my band, actually.
That was your band? I'm going to get to that. Would you slow down? My goodness gracious.
Anyway.
So it was your band. So could you tell us, because I think I spied Louis Bellson. I think I spied Ken Poplawski, and I think Chuck Wilson. Tell us a little bit about the personnel and how that was your band.
Well, I went to work for Benny Goodman in 1980. I was about to graduate from Manhattan School of Music, and I went to work for him. Actually, believe it or not, he was donating his arrangements, Byron, to the New York Public Library. Mm-hmm. And he needed somebody, like you mentioned, like a historian type, a musician, who could write the accompanying literature to accompany the collection. So I dropped out of school and went to work for Benny Goodman. And my job was to sit with him and ask him questions like, who wrote this arrangement? And there's 3 different versions of it. And blah, blah, blah. It was really great. And then I wound up, over the next couple of years, by pure happenstance. I mean, I was playing all the time, but becoming his personal manager, not just because I was there. And I had a big band in New York at that time, which you eventually guested with later on, many years later. And make a long story short, I made a record. I gave Benny a copy of the record. I was waiting to hear from him. He never would mention that he listened to it. But then he would call me on the phone with my record playing in the background and not acknowledge it. You know what I mean? It was driving me nuts, you know. So anyway, at the end of this story, he was approached by public television to put together a kind of like a 50th anniversary show of his big start in show business. And they, Dick Hyman, our dear friend Dick Hyman, put together a band of all the old original guys who played with Benny. And let's put it this way, there was no love lost between a lot of those guys and Benny for whatever reason. And they didn't want to do it. He didn't want to do it. And he decided that he would take my band, Totally, which had a couple of great veterans in it. It had Danny Bank and Eddie Burt and Bobby Pring. And that was about it. And Paulie Cohen, but that's another story. And he wound up taking the band, and it became the last Benny Goodman Orchestra. And of course, when he transformed it, it became something totally different. Mel Lewis was gone. Louis Belson came in. Dick Katz was gone. Dick Hyman came in. But that's the story. And that broadcast was 35 years ago. And, wow. It just brings back such great memories. But anyway, thanks for asking.
Well, you were part of history. I mean, starting from that point and on. Now, forgive me, and if you're uncomfortable with any questions, but I wanted to ask, and you could just say, pass. For some people, and I've talked to Ken Poplawski about this, and he has a philosophy. So Benny was hard to talk to sometimes, little difficult. And Kenny says, I think that Benny was just thinking about music all the time. And so any conversation with you, if he seemed sort of like wasn't really looking you straight in the eye and he was like off somewhere, it was because he had other thoughts and he was thinking about music, thinking about his horn, or just his general business. So it was a weird communication style. So how did you get close to him where other people couldn't? And what were you doing in terms of communication that brought you closer to Benny? Because he trusted you, Loren. I mean,
Did you say something? What? What? No, and he was kind of like that. I forget who it was. Maybe it was Ruby Braff or somebody once said, you think Benny's putting you off, or he's distant, or he's not paying attention. He's probably thinking about that F sharp. Seriously. I also knew Artie Shaw pretty well, and Byron, frankly, you're going to say no, but I put you in that category. When you get people who are really masters of an instrument, I think that there's a certain part of the brain, because I'm not that kind of saxophone player, but I know musicians like that when I meet them, and there's a certain channel that they're on all the time that is nothing but that C or that D or that embouchure kind of thing. And Benny was an extreme version of that, as was Artie Shaw. And that's the reason that Artie stopped playing the clarinet. He stopped playing when he was in his mid-40s because he said, I couldn't live like that anymore. There was more to life for me. I couldn't take the mental segregation, for lack of a better word, that it took to be like that. But with Benny, that's just who he was. Yeah, so that's a long way of answering your question, but I got along with him,
Mm-hmm. Was that frustrating for you? It's almost like a parent who you want to so much acknowledge you. I mean, you just told me he'd call up and your record would be playing, but you want him to say, I love the record,
Right.
And you want your parents to come to your gig sometimes and say, hey, that was a nice performance. And you're looking for that. And did you ever feel you got it from Benny? Or was it just the fact that he recognized you by letting him help him?
I mean, I was there, but a funny thing happened. But before we get to it, I want to mention one thing real quick.
Did you read it too?
Yeah, well, I worked with Fred way back when. We worked with Sylvia Sims, the singer.
Yes, and in the book, I think.
Well, I don't think it is. No, I don't think so. But anyway, I love this book, and I'm so glad that you are talking about books and you're talking about quotes and all kinds of stuff. I was really just knocked out by that. But getting back to with Benny, a funny thing happened. Right before we did that TV show, we did a warm-up show, because that show was for public television. And right before we did it, we did a break-in concert at Waterloo Village. It was a venue in New Jersey. A big kind of like barn, kind of like a Tanglewood kind of place. And we played there, and Benny did the most unbelievable thing. He got on the microphone, and he said, I want to thank a young man here who really put this whole thing together. In fact, I think his parents are here tonight. You want to stand up and take a bow? Now, Benny Goodman doing this, I mean, this would be like Don Rickles saying, like, all kidding aside, I think you're wonderful. Like, this was not in his bag of tricks.
Right, yeah.
And he announced my parents, And then he announced me, and I came up with Ken Poplawski and John Eckert, and we played a feature song. Unheard of. Now, after the concert, I'm through the roof. I mean, this was just my dream come true. I wasn't 30 years old yet. I was still in my 20s. Well, anyway, the people who knew Benny gave me a look like this, like. And I said, like, what's that? Yeah, and somehow it was like in The Godfather, like that when they kiss Fredo, and they go like, like this. It was the kiss of death. He only really singled out people and thanked people when they were about to get the axe. Yeah. So it's bittersweet for me, but I'll tell you something. At the vantage point of 30 years, or however long it's been, 35 years, it was an incredible honor. Kiss of death, end of story, whatever it was. I consider myself blessed. And when I heard you and John Clayton talking about your Basie stuff, and about going backstage, and you didn't know what was going to happen, and meeting these people, and all this kind of stuff, I imagine that I think about it the same way that you do. Although I think Basie was a much cooler guy than Benny Goodman. But
well, anyway, I mean, the fact that you went through that, and it's a continuing red thread that runs through our conversation today, and whenever people speak to you, is that's a major part, but also your associations with so many great musicians. As I mentioned in the intro, what's great about you as a historian and an educator is that you speak from personal experience with so many of these people, and I think that's really important. I do want to move, and we could talk about Benny forever, and I just wanted to get actually the Benny Goodman stuff kind of out the way, and there's more. We might circle back to it at some point, but I wanted to talk about your early years, and I just, I found out that you went to Manhattan School of Music, and the most interesting thing to that is you said something like that there were no dorms, and you'd stay with little old ladies. How did that, and it makes sense, because who's got time to pay for dorms in New York City, or the money to pay for dorms in New York City? So did you do that, or were you going back and forth from New Jersey when you attended Manhattan School?
I went to Manhattan School of Music in 1976, which was the old Juilliard School up at 122nd and Broadway, and they had no dorms. They subsequently built dorms, but there were no dorms throughout the 80s or the 90s. And so what you did was, up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, they had these, frankly, these little old ladies, for the most part, who owned large, pre-war apartments that paid probably rent controlled, pay next to nothing, big old apartments, and they were known for hosting students from Manhattan School of Music. So you could tell your parents the parents would be so nervous, my kid's moving to New York City, what's going to happen to him? Well, this lady's name was Miss Ash. Miss Ash has had students from the school for the last 40 years. She started when she was 60, and she hosts these kids, and she's very safe, and nothing funny goes on. And so that's what it was. Yeah, it was good.
Right. I mean, that's a kind of a cool story to know. And, I'd be a little nervous. Did you stay in one of those places?
Yeah, that's where I lived.
So could you practice? Or would you always practice at school?
No. Practicing was at school. Yeah. And, without going into great detail, if things went on in either my room or the other roommate's room that it emitted some kind of smoky odor or something like that, Miss Ash would somehow, she was in a wheelchair, and somehow she'd wind up bumping into your door with the wheelchair, at the moment that, that you were worried about bong water or something, but anyway, but that's another story. But she was wonderful.
Oh, I love that.
I can't believe I told that story.
That's a great story. It's the best story yet,
Yeah.
So what did you start out majoring in when you were?
Well, I was a music theory major. There was no jazz degree anywhere at that time. So jazz people became music theory majors. John Carisi was teaching there, Rusty Dedrick, all kinds of great folks. And I eventually became a saxophone major. But what happened to me was, around the corner from that apartment, right around the corner, this was 112th and Riverside Drive, and in that building were Rudy Rutherford and Oliver Jackson and a bunch of musicians. Right around the corner was the West End. And so I kind of became the house sub at the West End, not because I was necessarily so good, but because I lived around the corner and I played the piano and the saxophone. So this is where I got to meet Joe Jones and Eddie Durham and Paul Quinichette and all those people. So that was my education as much as Manhattan School of Music.
So was Phil Schaap there around the West End Cafe?
Phil Schaap was booking it, and I'll tell you something about Phil, who I wish the best to because he's not been feeling that well recently, but he's recovering. And the thing about Phil is everyone knows Phil Schaap, his radio shows and jazz history and his style and all the great things that he's done. But the one thing that people don't focus on, which I think is easily the equal of what he's done as a historian, was in the 1970s, people like Joe Jones and Russell Procope and Earl Warren and Buddy Tate, well, not Buddy Tate so much, but Gene Ramey and Francis Williams and Eddie Durham, and let's just Ram Ramirez, name all these people. Dickie Wells, for instance. Some of them were actually working as messengers on Wall Street. Some of them were bank guards, and many were just doing nothing. And Phil Schaap created this programming at the West End where he had maybe it was 6 nights a week or 7 nights a week. He had 6 different bands comprised of these great old veterans that were for the most part forgotten about. And instead of booking a band for 6 nights and another band for 6 nights, he had each band play 1 night a week. And all of a sudden, these guys who had been passed by. This is before Wynton Marsalis came to town. It's before this thing happened with the great reverence for the past and loving the past. It was a different time in 1976. Yeah. And so all of these guys, the guys who played with Fats Waller, the guys who played with Jimmy Lunsford, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, 1 day a week they got to put on their jacket and be who they were and go to a club and get paid to play in a club where Phil would give these long introductions, maybe too long, but he would give these long introductions. Man, this guy played with the Al Cobbs, the trombone player, all these people. And it was an incredible thing. And to Phil Schaap's eternal credit, it was such a beautiful thing to see. Yeah. And I was just a fly on the wall there subbing every so often, but I got to see it and I got to know those people. Yeah. So anyway, that's a huge part of my education. It was there that I joined the first real band that I was in, and that was a quartet that was led by Eddie Durham. Yeah, yeah.
Are there any other memories that, to us, I wasn't around so much in the 70s, but that would be old New York, real old New York. For jazz would be 40s and 30s and things like that. But that was a highlight for your life. Was there anything about that period that you remember or that you reminisce about constantly besides the West End Cafe or other places? I mean, I remember I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just remember coming to New York and I just freaked. I mean, I looked in the Village Voice, which doesn't exist, right, anymore, and I looked in the Village Voice and I just go right to the back and I'd see Tommy Flanagan, I could see him tonight, or Hank Jones, or I could see Art Farmer, or just like all the things. As you were closer to New York and being in New Jersey, so you were there all the time. To see this, I had these people on my records, and then to see that they're available live, and sometimes I would just go peek in the doors of what was that, of Sweet Basil, and where you could kind of see the band, the Jazz Messengers or somebody, and just to see them and maybe hear a little bit of because I couldn't always afford to go, and that was old New York to me, which doesn't exist in that way. But I'm sorry for interrupting you. Tell me what old New York was to you.
You kind of put it there. I mean, it was now you go back and look at the ads in the Village Voice, frankly, in the back where that 1 or 2 pages where the jazz clubs were, and it's like anything else. Took it for granted in a certain kind of way. Oh yeah, Hank Jones this week and Benny Green the next week and Tommy Flanagan the next week and whomever else. But yeah, so I mean, there was that scene, of course. But getting back to the generation of guys that I was so interested in other words, those are the giants and the names of not that many musicians who actually lived in New York played in those clubs. I mean, some of them did, like Bradley's and all that. But for the most part, it was always the big names who would come to the Vanguard and come to Sweet Basil and all that kind of stuff. And yes, that was incredible. But the other guys who weren't leaders or who weren't names in the jazz world, but who had been, there was a chock full of nuts on the corner of 50th and Broadway. And that was where most of the great old African-American musicians, for whatever reason, that place was where they where I could find them. And
was that? Help me with that place. Was that where you just buy those nuts, or what were they hanging out doing? Were
No,
they trying to drink?
Chock full of nuts. Chock full of nuts is the heavenly coffee. Heavenly coffee. And there was some lady who went, chock full of nuts is the heavenly coffee. Heavenly coffee. Anyway, so no, it was a quick coffee kind of place, coffee and donuts and all that kind of stuff. And that's where I met Howard McGee and got to work with Howard McGee. But so that's my memory of those days. And on the one hand, it was taken for granted, and on the other hand, it was a magic time.
Yeah, I'm sure you took all the energy from that period, and it comes out through your music and your desire and your love of it. I want to ask Alexa to play a quick video for us. That's video number 2, and just get your thoughts on the guy playing piano, if we could do that.
That has to be Joe Jones. Oh, man.
So tell me about that piano player, what he meant to you. If you get a chance, tell us how he drove you into New York City one time, and tell us about the drummer, if you'd like.
Well, I'll tell you something about Louis Bellson, who was in that film clip of Benny Goodman. He played that exact drum break once. He took the sticks on the tom-toms and went like bum ba ba bum ba ba, and he always said, "I got that from Joe Jones."
Oh,
but that was Teddy Wilson, and there were I got turned on to jazz by a copy of Benny Goodman's Carnegie Hall concert record with my local hometown library. And one day, looking in the newspaper, very shortly thereafter, I couldn't have been more than 13 or 14, and I hadn't started playing the saxophone yet. I was studying piano. I saw that Teddy Wilson was playing in Hackensack, New Jersey, an Italian restaurant, Sundays from 4 to 8. I said, how could this be the same guy who made these records with Lester Young and Billie Holiday? Well, he was. He lived in New Jersey, and when he wasn't on the road, he took whatever gig he could get just to keep in practice, and what the heck, better than staying home. Yeah. So my parents took me to see him, and he and then Hank Jones became like uncles. That's the only way that I can put it. Nobody in my family was into being a professional musician. No one in my family knew jazz musicians, whatever jazz musician meant at that time. And it was such a blessing that both Hank and Teddy, when my parents would take me to see them, were so avuncular and so warm that eventually my parents would let Teddy, mostly Hank actually, but Teddy also, they would drive me into New York where they were playing sometimes, and then they would let them drive me home. Now these are, a 15-year-old kid and jazz musician, but it wasn't jazz musician. And you know this, Byron, as well as I do, or better, the kind of people that Joe Wilder and Britt Woodman and Hank and all those people. I mean, these were just some of the most noble, and it's not like looking at it through rose-colored glasses. They were one in a million kind of people. And so my parents said, yeah, okay, fine, because they sussed them out.
Yeah.
And so when I see Teddy Wilson, I just think of so many wonderful memories, and what an incredible musician. Yeah.
Did you ever get to sit with him with a piano and learn from him that way?
Oh yeah, no. That was the key of those early days. Was they? I mean, to be frank with you, Teddy and Hank too. They didn't have that many 14, 15-year-old fans who were so hell-bent on hanging out with them or knew their old records or something like that. I mean, maybe the more contemporary, McCoy Tyner and Herbie Hancock and those people had lots of people paying attention to them. Yeah. But at that moment, people like Teddy and even Hank did not have a lot of fans. A lot of great musicians loved them. So, I would sit and just watch, and boy, was I lucky. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to just know that you were in the presence of somebody like Teddy there. And did you ever get to hang out with Joe Jones a little bit ever?
Oh yeah, I played in his quartet, subbing for Percy France or Harold Ashby a few weekends. But I was around him a lot because he was at the West End, and yes,
Because
I got to
Phil
know
Schaap
him.
was friends with him.
Phil. Well, Phil was very close with all of those guys. Roy Eldridge, specifically
Yeah.
Buddy Tate. Earl Warren was another mentor, and Joe Jones. But Joe was a special case because Joe was complicated, and as complicated as somebody could be, who saw the records that he had made make millions of dollars for other people, and who probably got $15 for playing on the record when it was made, who saw all the modern jazz drumming, and from Max Roach to Art Blakey to Philly Joe, they all, and Buddy Rich and Louis Bellson, they all went like this to Joe Jones. They all showed him nothing but the greatest respect, but that doesn't pay rent. And the music business, well, you know this, Byron, yeah. And by the way,
my rent now.
I didn't mean it like that, but there's a picture I put up on Facebook, and it brought back such a beautiful memory, and it was you, along with another great veteran, kind of in between the generations, Virgil Jones, and then one of the great Britt Woodman from the Duke Ellington Band.
Yeah.
And, and I made some kind of comment when I put it up. I said, well, they're playing this game called Tonk, which musicians played, and I'm sure that, Byron and, they're learning about it. And then I found out that you had been in a band with these guys for years on Broadway. You must have played 1,000 games of it, right?
So we played every day. Right. I get to the show at about 7:15 so I could play Tonk with Virgil and Jerome and Britt. And there were a couple other guys, Jimmy Kozier, Bill Easley. And so we would play. And if we had, which we did in that show, we had a 10-minute break where there was no music. So we could leave the pit and we would just run into the dressing room and play, 10 minutes worth of talk. And so that was that period of time playing on Broadway with those guys. It was absolutely amazing. Your stories are so heartwarming, and thank you so much for sharing it. I wanted to have Alexa. I sent you a picture, and I don't know if you have that. I'd like you to if you have a way of throwing that up. Let's see if we can get that.
Oh,
Lauren,
yeah.
Does that look familiar? You see those stand fronts have your name on it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, those are some of my favorite people in the world, and this is Ali Jackson on drums, who no one had heard of yet, but he later went to fame with Wynton. John Goldsby on the bass is currently the bass for years, has been in Cologne, West Germany, with the VDR band. James Chirillo's on the guitar. That's Bill Easley. Yeah. And when you have him on your show, let me know, because Bill must have some stories.
Bill will keep you laughing the whole time.
Oh God! And that's the great Lionel Hampton. I don't know who that is at the mic. He's so young and vivacious.
He's cute. Remember to stay cute.
This is the opening of the Louis Armstrong Archives, and sadly, the guy who put that all together just passed away a couple of weeks ago, the great Michael Cogswell. Yeah. But this is 1994, and they asked my big band, to come play with you in the role, not in the role of Louis Armstrong, but you as the featured soloist doing the Louis Armstrong repertoire, and Louis Armstrong's drummer in front of the band, and that is Lionel Hampton, because he became famous as Louis' drummer, and then eventually started playing the vibes, and that was you and Hamp, man, and you guys just tore it up.
We had good time.
Yeah. The one thing I just real quickly, because I know we don't have that much time left, but one thing I remember about it, you and me and Hamp were back in the office of the place before we were going to go out. We're talking about what tunes we're going to do. And we're going over, they had all these old charts. And I remember Sunny Side of the Street was one of them. And I remember talking to Hamp, going like, well, Hamp, and he didn't want to know. He didn't care what key it was in. He didn't. I remember he was like, oh, like this, and then he went out and played like he wrote these things.
Exactly. Yeah. That's Hamp. Hamp. Well, I put that up also to have you talk about this box set. And I think it's called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, 1923 through 1934. You helped with the liner notes on this, I understand?
Yeah, the great Dan Morgenstern, who another mentor of mine, he was tasked with writing the essay for that. That was quite a special project from the Smithsonian, and Sony put it together. And in the middle of it, Dan, something I forget what, I think maybe he was ill, or he had to leave the country. Something happened that he didn't expect, and he asked me if I could chime in and write. And so I chimed in and wrote some of it, and it wound up winning a Grammy Award. So I kind of like got to cop my name on it, mostly on his shoulders. But it's a great step.
You were a huge. It wasn't a stretch for you to take that project, because you're a huge Louis Armstrong fan, and I've heard you to compare him to Roger Bannister. Can you talk about a little bit that way of like being the first?
Oh yeah. Well, there's a guy named Jack Bradley. Mm-hmm. And when I was 13 or 14, I wound up being a full-time weekend volunteer at a place called the New York Jazz Museum. It was the first jazz museum. It didn't last long. And Louis Armstrong died in 71. And this was 72 and 73. And Jack had been like a son to Louis Armstrong. And so all the guys in Louis' band would come in, and I used to that's the wrong word. I used to take care of Clarence Armstrong, who was Louis' kind of cousin, who he treated as an adopted son. Yeah. So I was in this world, and Jack felt about Louis Armstrong the way that most people feel about a religious figure. Wow. And when he first talked about it, I thought he was a little nuts, because he always called himself a disciple of Louis Armstrong. And then I got to meet Zooty Singleton's widow, and I got to meet Joe Muraney and all these people. And you want to know something? About 15 years later, a wonderful woman, a pastor named Janice Steed, was writing a piece about Duke Ellington's sacred work, and she said to me as a part of the book, tell me about your spiritual beliefs, And I said, well, all I can tell you is that Louis Armstrong functions in my life like most people, the people look to for a spiritual presence. He really does. Now, what Louis Armstrong did on the trumpet, and I'm talking to Byron Stripling here, so this is kind of ironic here, but the point that I'm making is, when I was a kid, people always talked about Roger Bannister and how he ran the mile in 4 minutes. And that up until he ran the mile in 4 minutes, it was unheard of. It was just, people couldn't break it, And Louis Armstrong took this instrument and reinvented it. The trumpet had never been played like that. Classical, symphonic players, military players. It was not only brilliant trumpet playing, it was a new way of actually playing the instrument. Well, as soon as he did it, as soon as Roger Bannister ran that mile, within years you had high school students doing a 4-minute mile. And with Louis Armstrong, as soon as he showed that this thing could be done, then you had a Byron Stripling, then you had a Ernie Royal, then you had a Wynton Marsalis, then you had all these people who could kind of do it because he showed the way. Right. And I just have to say here, and I'm not trying to be unctuous, but, I've always loved, and I've never had a chance to really to talk to you about it, or it wouldn't have made sense just in the course of a conversation. But, the way that you have all these years taken the Louis Armstrong inspiration and done something with it that when I listen to it, I think two things. I think I think three things. Well, I think four things. Okay, here's a guy who can sing really nice. Here is, just from a sheer instrumental angle, here's a great trumpet player. Number three, here's somebody who loves Louis Armstrong, but even more importantly, here's somebody who, when I hear it sounds like Byron.
That's very nice.
And I would never have the opportunity to say that to you. By the way, you can send that check to 189 Claremont Avenue, New York. But all kidding aside, no, man. But I mean it from the bottom of my heart.
I appreciate that. And I thank you. Look, as long as we're tossing back and forth, I thank you for hiring me all the times you did. I did a party for you with your big band one time. I don't know what it was for. It was for like some kind of corporate thing. Right. I did it, and I sat in a section. I played the Ellington conference or something at the Hilton or the Sheraton with Louis Bellson on drums, which that was amazing. And you had all these Ellington things that nobody had ever heard. You were able to help premiere those. Yeah. There were other circumstances.
Benny Carter at the Kennedy Center.
At the whole thing, yeah. I mean, you were always there, and I needed to work, Loren. And I just thank you for that, and thank you for. And before we leave, I want to make sure you have my phone number, because if there's anything else that comes up, look, I want to ask you about Fair Lawn, New Jersey, and moving in. And any question is uncomfortable, just tell me. So, moving in, and I don't know how many, if there were any Jewish people in that community or not, but was that a comfortable situation for your parents? You're there in Bergen County. Was that part of it an easy thing for you guys, or?
I don't know what you're talking about. No. Well, I'll try and answer it briefly. My family was the first Jewish family to move into the area that we lived in. And on the day that they moved in 1953, all the neighbors put up for sale signs. I wasn't born yet, but this is what I heard. As they drove up the street with the van and the car, for sale signs, which they took down the next day. Yeah. It wound up becoming a wonderful community, and I only mention this because you raised the issue. It wouldn't come to mind, but I think it's part of the story. My father became president of the Fair Housing Council in the 60s, and in the same way that we were the first Jewish family in that part of town, he was the one who helped integrate our town racially with the first African American family moving in, which resulted in the horrible phone calls and all that kind of stuff. But that was a big part of my upbringing, and still is, because as W.E. Well, I'm about to go into my lecture teaching. I'll stop there. But it's a very important thing, and what your orchestra is doing out there also is tremendously important, especially at a time like this, because not only do you program great music with superlative musicians, and I don't know many of the guys in the band, I know of them, because I know Mark Lopeman and I know Chuck Wilson and Jack Stuckey and Joe Lovano and all the guys, and Ken Poplawski, the Ohio mafia of jazz guys, and I know about the people in this orchestra, and the fact that you are maintaining such a high level thing and offering people the large context of jazz. Not just what's popular now, not just what's popular then, but somehow making it as functional and fun as it was, and serious. The way I like to think about it is, and we try the same thing at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. It's so much fun you can be serious, and it's so serious you better have some fun, because otherwise you're going to be screwed. And so that's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing those thoughts. I mean, I know that these things are personal, and I'm going to continue to get personal. I want to talk about all these older black jazz musicians: Benny Carter, Teddy Wilson, Hank Jones. We've been talking about them. Joe Wilder, Bobby Short. Our audience doesn't know some of these people, but Bobby Short was one of the great piano players, cabaret singers. He could sing the blues. He could sing the American songbook like nobody else in the world. The love you have for these musicians and how they accepted you into their world is almost emotional for you. It must be. And are there any thoughts that you would have on the acceptance of those guys? I mean, you've already told us that your parents let you go to New York City at 15, 16 years old with Teddy Wilson. You're just you and Teddy in a car. And could have been weird had that car got stopped for a traffic ticket or something like that, a speeding ticket or something like that.
Oh yeah, that's right. I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, you never think of that stuff until I have other stories, but I can't share them. But yeah, with myself. But what is it about that's so special to you, if I can ask, if that's not too intrusive?
Well, no, it's not intrusive. I'd like to talk about it. I don't know how much, I don't think we have enough time really to get into it, but it's a very deep thing for me. And all I can say is this is how I looked at it, or how I look at it now. The old swap thing. In other words, people talk about the things that maybe this president does, and if Obama had done it. And I mean, let's forget politics, okay? But the way that I was welcomed warmly into a world of mostly older folks who came up at a time in the mid 20th century, early 20th century, and I was the other, or I was the outsider. And based on a love of the music, the door opened into a world. And yeah, it is emotional. If I start, it's hard to think about it really hard that I'll tear up. But it was, I don't think it would have been the same way. Liberal people where I grew up, the same. It couldn't have been exactly the same if you reverse it. Mm-hmm. It would have been good, but not like what I saw, and I know that from the inside.
Yeah.
And I'll put it this way: it gave me a window into what, as far as I could understand it, for what the music, where the music came from, what the music means, and the fact that if you loved it, then that's all you really needed. It's a hard way to, I don't know if that makes any sense. But.
Did those guys ever share stories of you, of the hardship? For instance, Buddy DeFranco, I remember him telling me he toured with Art Blakey in his own quartet at one point, and people would say, look, if you're bringing that Art Blakey guy here, you're going to have to, you need to get a sub for tonight because we won't allow that black guy, Art Blakey, one of the greatest drummers in the world, we don't allow him to play in the club. And then, Buddy DeFranco said, well, then you're going to have to get another band, and the fact that guys like Buddy stood up, guys like Benny Goodman stood up and said, I want Teddy Wilson in the band, I want Lionel Hampton in the band, I want Hootie Williams in my band, Artie Shaw says, I want Billie Holiday, I want Roy Eldridge, and these guys, and that's taken a chance. Really?
Well, yes, I will tell you briefly a flip side funny story.
Sure.
Of the exact same phenomenon, but flipped.
Sure.
There was a band called the Harlem Blues and Jazz Band. And, right, you remember them? I'm sure you probably played with them. And I used to sub in that band a lot. Yeah. And there was a tour in Florida. Now, the band was Al Casey, Eddie Durham, Haywood Henry, Belton Evans on drums, and Johnny Williams on bass. Okay. Yeah. And these were all great African-American musicians. The youngest one had to be 75 years old.
Yeah.
And George Kelly on saxophone. And George Kelly had come from Florida. We were in Florida. And the band manager, the guy who ran the band, Doc Vollmer, he got sick. He asked me if all of a sudden, without any preparation, I could drive the van. So I drove this band of me and these over 75-year-old guys all around Florida. And George Kelly was telling us these stories about how Florida was actually, he said, the worst state of the South for prejudice and racism back in the day. Worse than Mississippi, worse than all that stuff. Anyway, so we were way down in southern Florida driving, and we're going through this small town to play in their library. And all of a sudden, the guys are cracking up. I'm driving, and I hear them all laughing and say, what's so funny? They go, we'll tell you later. So we get to the guys, and what was so funny? They said, you should have seen the looks on the white folks looking at this white boy driving all of us around in this van. Now, again, I hope that story is understood in context, because out of context, it can sound ridiculous. But that's that was one humorous way. But, of course, most of the other ways were not humorous, of course. But again, how they warmly, they recognized not just me, but all the other people who were not of either their race or their generation or their background, if the common denominator was a sincere love of the music. And anyway,
I was go back during that time. That's why I was saying it was hard for leaders like Buddy DeFranco, Artie Shaw, Benny Goodman to do that, and it showed what they really felt. I always think about, if you watch some of the Martin Luther King marches, in the front there's often a priest and a nun, white. And I wonder what it was like for them to go back that next Sunday to their churches and to their place. Probably got a little bit of heat from some people, because it took courage to be in marches like that with them. And the nuns would march in their whole full regalia, and the priest would have the whole thing. And you're on the front page of the paper. And, you're going to have some guy back at the church going, So what were you doing last Saturday? You know, that kind of thing.
Well, and all we have to do is, and this might be a, but as we can see with what's happening right now in 2020, right now, in every way, the virus and everything else, we can see how important all those things were and how important it is, the project that you're doing here, which is on the one hand historic and about understanding the past, but the fact that you're doing it in 2020.
Yeah.
And the fact that you have supporters and people who are going to carry you through this thing to make sure that something like your enterprise, which is needed now more than ever, can continue. And it's very important.
We have the greatest fans in the world, and I say to them constantly, we love you and we thank you for your support. I want to move to something that you did that was quite historic. I have two comments about that on our comment section. And this one's from Zach Compton, who is head of our education department. And he said, Loren, thank you for your incredible radio series on jazz drumming history with Mel Lewis. I'd love to hear a Mel story. The second one comes from a guy named John Drake. And he said, today is Mel Lewis's birthday. I didn't know that. It says, thanks for his history of jazz drummers. It's also a couple other people's birthday. Can you fill us in on all these birthdays?
Sure. Well, my mom would have been 100 years old today. She passed away 8 years ago, and she was born in Buffalo. And Mel Lewis was born in Buffalo. On my mom's 9th birthday, they didn't know each other, but it turns out that they were both born there. The Mel Lewis Jazz History tapes, I did jazz radio for many years, and we had 20 or 25 hours of Mel Lewis talking about the history of jazz drums. We did it first in 1984, and then Kenny Washington and I both had copies of the tapes. We both lost them.
Huh, really?
And then I lost mine anyway. In 1989, I went back to Mel and said, let's just do it again. And sadly, Mel was getting treated for the cancer that killed him in early 1990, and thank God we did that series. And everybody from Charlie Watts to I don't know whom else has copies of these things, and it was good. So anyway, thank you to your listeners. They're online somewhere, and you can find them.
Well, and do you have 2 seconds to tell us any Mel story about that period at all?
Well, most stories about Mel are, he was quite loquacious, but the most important thing about Mel was what you call a signature drummer. I remember him talking about that to me. He said, there are a handful of cats, and you know this, Byron. You can listen to 16 bars of a band playing, and most lay folks, most non-musicians won't believe this. You can tell who the drummer is. Only a handful of drummers. And Mel was one of those drummers that, man, you listen to, and he had his own thing.
Yes.
And he was brutally honest and tough on everybody, and brutally tough and honest on himself. Wow. And he was just a wonderful, wonderful man. I'd love to come back sometime and talk some more about things.
Anytime. Well, look, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to be with us. One of the things that I think that you do is you talked about jazz, and you say, don't overthink it. It's accessible to all of us. And you say that jazz is like the air that we breathe. I love that when you talk about that. And I think one of your goals and purposes in life, and you've already accomplished this, is that you want to bring people to jazz. People say that they don't like jazz, and you always talk about, like, well, what don't you like about it? And people feel they have to have. Do you have 2 seconds to tell us about, like, you compare it to eating salmon, like?
Okay, sure. And you know this, Byron, and 95 out of 100 people that I've met in the last 40 years, and I mean this literally, this is not hyperbole, literally, if you meet them and you don't have your saxophone or your trumpet, so what do you do? Oh, I'm a jazz musician. Really? That's funny. I like jazz. I really don't know a lot about it, but I like it. And I say, when you order salmon in a restaurant, do you say to the waiter, I'll have the salmon, please. By the way, I don't know a lot about salmon, but I like it anyway. Say, man, you don't feel the need to express your ignorance, but something's happened with the music. And so I join you in that. Byron, that, there's, it's like anything else, man. You want to learn about salmon? Yeah, you can learn about it. And trust me, there are the salmon PhDs of the world and the jazz PhDs, but you got to really enjoy it. I've got to go, man, but this has been wonderful.
We love you so much, Loren. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. We appreciate everything you do and what you've done for jazz. You are simply, as Tina Turner would say, the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We want to remind our audience to share this video. It'll be up as soon as possible. Share with your friends. Like us as soon as you can. And then on Thursday, Zach Compton will be back with Hank Marsh stories from Hank Marsh friends all during that era. We love everybody. Thanks again to Loren Schoenberg.